Welcome to Sherlock's Casebook, where every mystery has a story, and every story hides a secret. Step into the world of deduction, suspense, and untold cases of Sherlock Holmes. Are you ready to uncover the truth? A perplexing crime. It was on a bitterly cold evening in late November that I, Dr. John Watson, found myself once again in the company of my remarkable friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The fire in our sitting room at 221B Baker Street crackled merrily, yet the warmth did little to dissipate the thick London fog that had seeped into the very bones of the city. Holmes, seated in his accustomed armchair, gazed contemplatively at the ceiling, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. I had just set down the evening edition of the Times when the sound of hurried footsteps ascended our staircase. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson's voice, tinged with exasperation, announced our visitor. "A Mr. Felix Carraway, to see you, Mr. Holmes." Holmes sprang to his feet as a man in his mid-40s strode into the room, his face pale and haggard. His clothes, though finely tailored, were in disarray, as though he had dressed in great haste. His hands trembled as he removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked prematurely with grey. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he gasped, "you must help me. I am accused of a crime most dreadful, and yet I swear upon my soul I am innocent." Holmes gestured for him to take a seat. "Pray, compose yourself, Mr. Carraway. Tell us everything and be precise." Carraway swallowed hard and drew a handkerchief across his brow. "It is a matter of murder, sir. The body of Lord Percival, Ashcombe, was discovered this morning, stabbed to death in his study at Ashcombe Manor. Scotland Yard believes I am responsible." Holmes's sharp grey eyes gleamed with interest. "And what reason do they give for suspecting you?" Carraway hesitated. "Because, Mr. Holmes, I was the last to see him alive, and I was found standing over his body, holding the murder weapon." A silence fell upon the room. Watson, ever the sceptic, glanced at Holmes, whose expression betrayed neither belief nor doubt, only the keen, calculating gaze of a man already beginning to untangle the threads of deception. Holmes finally spoke. "Mr. Carraway, I shall take your case, but be warned, if you are lying to me, I shall uncover the truth regardless." Carraway exhaled deeply, his relief evident. "I have nothing to hide, Mr. Holmes." Holmes leaned forward, the firelight casting long shadows across his sharp features. "Then let us begin. Case introduction." Felix Carraway sat rigidly in his chair, his hands clasped tightly together, as though he feared they might betray him. The flickering gaslight cast uneasy shadows upon his drawn face, and for a moment the only sound in the room was the rhythmic ticking of the clock upon the mantelpiece. Holmes, his sharp features unreadable, leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Now, Mr. Carraway," he said at last, his voice calm but commanding, "begin at the beginning, and omit nothing, however trivial it may seem." Carraway swallowed hard. "I arrived at Ashcombe Manor last evening," he began. "Lord Percival had invited me to discuss a matter of some urgency, though he would not reveal the nature of it in his letter. When I arrived, I found him in an agitated state. He spoke in riddles, hinting at a great betrayal, but refusing to name names. He seemed to suspect some treachery within his household." Holmes raised an eyebrow. Did he, by chance, mention a will or any financial concerns? Carraway hesitated. No, nothing of the sort. He was more concerned with— He paused as if choosing his words carefully. Loyalty. He spoke of false friends, of deception, of a web of lies closing in around him. I asked him plainly who he feared, but he only shook his head and said, "It is already too late." Curious, murmured Holmes. And what transpired after this ominous declaration? We dined together. He seemed calmer as the evening progressed, though still guarded. Around 10 o'clock, he retired to his study, leaving me in the drawing-room. I lingered for a time, then made my way to the guest quarters. It was well past midnight when I heard a noise, a thud, followed by what I can only describe as a strangled cry. I rushed to his study and found him. Carraway's voice faltered. He swallowed and continued. Collapsed on the floor. There was blood. Too much of it. And in my hand, he shuddered, a dagger. I do not know how it came to be there. I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, I had no recollection of taking hold of it. Watson, who had been listening intently, frowned. And yet, you were found with the weapon in your grasp? Yes. The servants heard the commotion and came running. By the time they arrived, I was still standing over him, the blade in my hand. The butler, Mr. Talbot, cried out and pulled me away. Within the hour, Scotland Yard had arrived, and I was placed under house arrest. Holmes had not moved during this entire account, his gaze fixed upon some distant point known only to himself. At last he spoke. Watson, what do you make of this? I considered for a moment. The case against Mr. Carraway seems damning, but there are gaps. Why would he call for help if he were truly the murderer? And what of Lord Ashcombe's cryptic warnings? If he suspected foul play, surely he had some notion of who might wish him harm. Holmes nodded approvingly. Indeed, there is more here than meets the eye. He turned to Carraway. You mentioned a dagger. Describe it. It was ornate, Carraway said, an heirloom of the Ashcombe family, a silver hilt with an emerald set into the pommel. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Very distinctive. Was it kept in the study? Carraway hesitated. Yes, upon the mantelpiece. Lord Ashcombe often admired it, but I had never known him to remove it from its place. Holmes tapped his fingers together. Curious indeed. Tell me, Mr. Carraway, who else was in the house that night? Carraway exhaled sharply. Aside from myself and Lord Ashcombe, there were 4 others. Mr. Talbot, the butler, Miss Eleanor, Ashcombe, his niece, a guest, Sir Reginald Blakemore, an old family friend, and a maid, Alice Harrow. They were all present when I was found, and they all believe me guilty. Holmes sprang to his feet with sudden energy. Then, Watson, we have no time to lose. We must visit Ashcombe Manor at once. The game is afoot. Early investigation. The journey to Ashcombe Manor was a solemn one. The clatter of hooves against the damp cobblestones of London giving way to the muffled silence of the countryside. A thick mist clung to the rolling landscape, swallowing the moonlight and shrouding the great house in an eerie gloom as our carriage approached the long, winding driveway. The manor itself was an imposing structure of grey stone, its towering, windows staring out like vacant eyes. A single lamp burned dimly on the front porch, casting elongated shadows upon the gravel path. As we disembarked, the great oak door creaked open, and a tall, thin figure emerged, his lined face etched with suspicion. "Mr. Holmes, I presume?" he inquired, his voice clipped and formal. Holmes regarded him keenly. "And you, I suspect, are Mr. Talbot, the butler." Talbot inclined his head but said nothing more, stepping aside to allow us entry. The interior of Ashcombe Manor was as austere as its exterior, its grand hall adorned with dark wooden panelling and an air of oppressive silence. As we removed our coats, Holmes's sharp gaze swept over the surroundings, absorbing every detail. "I should like to see the study," he announced. Talbot hesitated. "The police have already conducted their investigation, sir. I doubt there is anything more to be found." Holmes smiled thinly. "That remains to be seen." Without waiting for a response, he strode forward, leading the way down a long corridor until we reached a set of heavy double doors. Talbot pushed them open, revealing the crime scene. The study was a grand chamber, lined with shelves of leather-bound books. A large oak desk stood before a tall window, its surface cluttered with papers, but it was the sight of the thick, dried bloodstain upon the Persian rug that drew our attention. The fireplace, dark and empty, loomed over the room like a silent witness. Above the mantelpiece, an empty bracket marked where the infamous dagger had once rested. Holmes moved with purpose, crouching beside the bloodstain. "Watson, observe the pattern here. Does it not strike you as peculiar?" I stepped closer, my medical training guiding my eye. The blood appears to have pooled, suggesting Lord Ashcombe lay here for some time before being discovered. Holmes nodded. "Precisely. And yet, Mr. Carroway claims he arrived mere moments after hearing the struggle. If that were true, one would expect a more erratic pattern, a sign of movement, of life ebbing away." He stood abruptly, turning his attention to the mantelpiece. Running a gloved hand over the empty bracket, he muttered, "Curious." "What is it, Holmes?" I asked. "Simply that this dust pattern suggests the dagger was removed some time ago. It was not wrenched from its place in a sudden act of violence. It was taken deliberately. The question is, when?" Before I could respond, a voice interrupted us. "You will find no answers there, Mr. Holmes." We turned to see a striking woman standing in the doorway, her dark eyes unreadable. She was clad in mourning black, though the severity of her attire did little to diminish her natural elegance. "Eleanor Ashcombe, I presume?" Holmes inquired, studying her with an intensity that would have unsettled a weaker spirit. She met his gaze unflinchingly. "Indeed, and you must be the great detective my uncle spoke of with such admiration." Holmes inclined his head. "I trust you will not object if I make my own inquiries." She stepped further into the room, her hands clasped tightly before her. "If you believe it will help find the truth, Mr. Holmes, then by all means proceed. But I must warn you, this house is built on secrets, and not all of them will welcome the light of day." Holmes's lips curled into the faintest smile. "Then it is fortunate, Miss Ashcombe, that I do not fear the dark." First suspects and misdirection. Miss Eleanor Ashcombe stood in the dimly lit study, the firelight casting a warm glow upon her pale features. Though she held herself with poise, there was a sharpness to her gaze, a wariness that did not escape Holmes's notice. "You speak of secrets, Miss Ashcombe," he said smoothly. "Pray, enlighten us. What truths lurk within these walls? She hesitated, her hands tightening around the black lace of her dress. My uncle was a man of great wealth and influence, Mr. Holmes, but he was not without enemies. There were disagreements within the family, arguments about inheritance, about loyalty. I do not believe Felix Carraway capable of murder, but there are others who had cause to see my uncle dead. Holmes studied her intently. Others, Miss Ashcombe? She turned away as if weighing her words. Sir Reginald Blakemore, for one. He and my uncle had been friends for years, but recently their relationship had soured. There was talk of a failed business venture, money lost, and bitter accusations. My uncle intended to cut him off entirely. And yet he was here as a guest, Watson interjected. Yes, my uncle believed in second chances, she said softly, perhaps to his own detriment. Holmes nodded, filing the information away. And what of the household staff? She hesitated again. Talbot has served this house for over 20 years, but lately my uncle had grown distrustful of him. He suspected Talbot of stealing from him, though no proof was ever found. And then there is Alice Harrow, the maid. She was devoted to my uncle, perhaps too devoted. Some say she was more than just a servant to him. If so, she has lost everything with his passing. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Interesting. And tell me, Miss Ashcombe, where were you when the murder occurred? Eleanor's expression did not falter. In my chambers reading. I heard nothing until the commotion awoke me. Holmes held her gaze for a long moment before offering a slight nod. I see. Before she could respond, a voice rang out from the hall, deep and imperious. This is outrageous! A circus act, nothing more! A tall, broad-shouldered man strode into the room, his face flushed with indignation. His thick grey moustache bristled as he glared at Holmes. I will not stand by while some meddling detective pokes around my friend's affairs. Sir Reginald Blakemore, I presume, Holmes said mildly. You presume correctly, sir, Blakemore snapped, and I'll have you know that this entire charade is a waste of time. The man responsible has already been caught. You refer to Mr. Carraway. Of course, Blakemore scoffed. He was found with the dagger in his hand, was he not? What more proof do you require? Holmes smiled faintly. A great deal more, I assure you. Blakemore narrowed his eyes. And what, pray, is your theory? Holmes turned back toward the blood-stained rug, his expression unreadable. I have no theories, Sir Reginald, only facts. Blakemore snorted. Then let us hope, Mr. Holmes, that your facts do not lead you astray. With that, he stormed from the room, leaving a tense silence in his wake. Watson exhaled, shaking his head. A man of great subtlety, that one. Holmes's lips twitched with amusement. Indeed. But tell me, Watson, did you notice the inconsistency? I frowned. What inconsistency? Holmes's gaze lingered on the door through which Blakemore had exited. A man so insistent on Carraway's guilt, so certain of the case against him, is either a fool. He turned back to the crime scene, his voice lowering. Ush, de souk. Or he is hiding something. The secret clue. The study had fallen into silence once more, save for the occasional crackle of the dying fire. Holmes stood motionless, his keen eyes roving over the crime scene, as if reading invisible words upon the walls. Then, with a sudden flick of his coat, he crouched near the desk, his fingers grazing the polished mahogany surface. "Watson," he murmured, "come closer. Tell me what you see." I stepped forward, peering at the desk. Scattered papers, an ink blotter, and a brass letter opener lay undisturbed. Nothing seemed amiss. Nothing of note, I admitted. Holmes chuckled. "Precisely. Nothing is precisely the problem." He reached forward and traced a faint outline in the thin layer of dust upon the wood. Observe, an empty space, free of dust. Something rested here, recently removed. A book, I guessed. Holmes shook his head. Too large for a book. A box, perhaps. A document case. Whatever it was taken before the authorities arrived. Likely before the body was discovered. He turned toward Eleanor Ashcombe. "Miss Ashcombe, did your uncle keep any valuable documents in his study?" Eleanor hesitated. "My uncle was meticulous with his affairs. He kept ledgers, personal letters, financial records. But if something was taken, I cannot say what." Holmes tapped his fingers against the desk, his mind working swiftly. "Curious. A man is murdered, and yet our culprit risks exposure to take one specific thing. That suggests a motive beyond mere violence." Watson frowned. Then perhaps this was not simply an act of passion? "Precisely," Holmes murmured. "There is method in this madness." He turned sharply. "Talbot!" The butler, who had remained silent in the corner, stiffened. "Sir, when you discovered the body, did you notice anyone near the study before Mr. Carroway arrived?" Talbot hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. I cannot be certain, sir. There was much confusion. But now that you ask, I did hear footsteps in the corridor before the commotion began. Light ones. A lady's, perhaps." Eleanor's expression darkened. "You mean to accuse me?" Talbot bowed his head slightly. "I mean no disrespect, Miss Ashcombe. I only say what I recall." Holmes observed the exchange with keen interest. Then, as if dismissing the matter, he turned abruptly to the fireplace. "Watson, assist me for a moment." He knelt before the hearth, and, with a gloved hand, sifted through the ashes. Something blackened and fragile caught in his fingers. A charred scrap of parchment. He held it to the light. "Interesting," he murmured. "The edges are burnt, but the centre remains. Someone tried to destroy this in a hurry." Watson peered closer. "Can you make out any writing?" Holmes studied the fragment. Only part of a phrase, regarding the matter of inheritance. A flicker of something unreadable passed over Eleanor's face. Holmes noticed. "Miss Ashcombe, are you quite certain you know nothing of your uncle's recent affairs?" She hesitated a fraction too long. "I knew my uncle was drafting a new will." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And was this new will to favour you, or someone else?" Eleanor's hands tightened at her sides. "I do not know, Mr. Holmes." Holmes said nothing, but I could tell he did not believe her. At that moment a sharp knock at the door interrupted us. A uniformed officer stepped in, his expression grim. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes," he said, "but there's been another development." Holmes turned, his interest piqued. "Go on." The officer hesitated. There's been another death, sir." For the first time that evening, even Holmes seemed surprised. "Who?" The officer swallowed. "Alice Harrow, the maid. She was found in her quarters not an hour ago. Poisoned." A cold silence fell over the room. Holmes's voice was barely above a whisper. "Watson, I fear we are running out of time." Rising stakes. A hush fell over the study, the weight of the officer's words sinking into the room like a shroud. Alice Harrow, dead. A second victim in a case that had already begun to twist into a labyrinth of deception. Holmes straightened, his fingers tightening around the scrap of burnt parchment. "Take us to her." We followed the officer through the dim corridors of Ashcombe Manor, the flickering gas lamps casting wavering shadows along the walls. Holmes walked with a quiet urgency, his expression dark with thought. Miss Harrow's quarters were modest, a stark contrast to the grandeur of the rest of the house. The bed was neatly made, a single candle still burning low on the bedside table. But it was the still figure upon the floor that drew our attention. Alice Harrow lay sprawled at the foot of her small writing desk, her face frozen in an expression of mild surprise. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture or desperate grasping at life, only an empty teacup beside her lifeless hand. Holmes knelt and carefully examined the body. He sniffed the rim of the cup and exhaled through his nose. "Bitter almonds." "Poison?" I asked. "Cyanide, I suspect." He gestured toward the desk. "But notice, Watson, her pen is uncapped, her ink still wet. She was writing when she died. Insuxuot, ensuux." I turned to the desk. Indeed, an unfinished note lay before us, the last words scrawled in a shaky hand. "Forgive me, but I must speak the truth. Lord Ashcombe's murder." The sentence ended abruptly. Watson exhaled. She was silenced before she could finish. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Precisely. This was no mere suicide, but a desperate attempt to prevent her from revealing what she knew. He turned to the officer. "Who found her?" "Talbot, sir," the man replied. "He came to fetch her for questioning, but when she did not answer, he forced the door open." Holmes nodded. "Then we must ask him what he saw." We retraced our steps to the grand hall, where Talbot stood waiting, his usual composure marred by unease. Holmes wasted no time. "Talbot, did you touch anything in Miss Harrow's room before we arrived?" The butler shook his head. "No, sir. Only checked for a pulse, but she was already gone." "Did she receive any visitors before her death?" Talbot hesitated. "Not that I saw, sir, but—" He glanced over his shoulder, lowering his voice. "Sir, Reginald was speaking with her earlier this evening. I overheard them in hushed tones. She sounded distressed, sir, though I could not make out their words." Holmes's lips pressed into a thin line. "Sir Reginald again?" Watson frowned. Could she have confided in him? And if so, did she seal her fate by doing so? Before Holmes could answer, a new voice echoed from the grand staircase. "Mr. Holmes, I must speak with you." Eleanor Ashcombe descended the stairs, her face pale but determined. She glanced at the gathered officers before fixing her gaze on Holmes. "I have remembered something important, something about my uncle's missing papers." Holmes studied her, his sharp gaze weighing every nuance of her expression. "Then I suggest, Miss Ashcombe, that you tell me everything you know. for I fear the next body we find may be yours. Holmes's strategic play. The air in the grand hall seemed heavier, charged with an unseen tension as Holmes regarded Eleanor Ashcombe with unwavering scrutiny. She stood before us, her hands clasped tightly together, as though steadying herself for what she was about to reveal. "Miss Ashcombe," Holmes said softly, "you spoke of your uncle's missing papers. What precisely do you remember?" She took a breath. "Earlier this week, I saw my uncle handling a document in his study. It seemed important. He was deep in thought, troubled even. When I asked about it, he merely told me that some matters were best left undisturbed." Holmes's eyes flickered with interest. "And you believe this document was stolen the night of his murder?" Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "I do. I overheard my uncle arguing with Sir Reginald that very evening. My uncle accused him of deceit, of betrayal. He said, 'I have proof now, Reginald. Do not think you can escape the consequences.' Those were his exact words." Watson and I exchanged a glance. "And yet Sir Reginald was one of the first to declare the case closed," Watson murmured. "Quite so," Holmes said. "He was most eager to see Felix Carroway blamed. Almost too eager." Eleanor shifted anxiously. "You believe Sir Reginald is responsible?" Holmes turned away, his hands clasped behind his back as he began pacing the hall. A man desperate to suppress damaging evidence might resort to violence. But what concerns me more is the methodical nature of these crimes. Lord Ashcombe's death could have been seen as an unfortunate incident, until Alice Harrow was murdered to ensure her silence. Holmes paused mid-step, then turned abruptly toward Eleanor. "Miss Ashcombe, you are in possession of something. You do not realize something your uncle entrusted to you, even indirectly." She frowned. I don't understand." "Think, Miss Ashcombe," Holmes pressed. "Did your uncle give you anything before his death? A letter? A key? A seemingly trivial item that might hold significance?" Eleanor's brow furrowed, and then, suddenly, her eyes widened. "A book," she whispered. "The night before his death, my uncle handed me a book and told me to keep it safe. I thought nothing of it. It was just an old volume of poetry. But now you suspect otherwise." Holmes finished for her. "Where is this book now?" "In my chambers." Holmes turned on his heel. "Then we must retrieve it at once." Before anyone could move, a sharp voice cut through the air. "I rather think not, Mr. Holmes." Sir Reginald Blakemore stood at the top of the staircase, his expression as hard as stone. In his hand, gleaming under the flickering candlelight, was a revolver. Watson tensed beside me. Eleanor gasped. "The deal?" Officers in the hall froze, their hands moving toward their own weapons. Holmes, however, remained perfectly still. "Sir Reginald," he said smoothly, "I had wondered when you would finally reveal yourself." Blakemore descended the stairs, his steps measured, his grip on the revolver steady. "You meddling fool," he growled. "You should have left well enough alone." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "And yet, here we are. The book, I presume, contains evidence, perhaps letters, financial records, or an altered will, something that would expose you." Blakemore's eyes flickered just for an instant, but it was enough. Holmes pressed on. Lord Ashcombe discovered your betrayal, and he intended to ruin you. But rather than allow that to happen, you silenced him. When Alice Harrow came to, close to the truth, you silenced her as well." Blakemore's lips curled into a sneer. "And now I must silence you." The tension in the room was suffocating. The officers stood at the ready, but none dared make the first move. I could feel my own pulse hammering in my ears. Holmes, however, remained utterly composed. "I anticipated you might take such drastic action, Sir Reginald," he said lightly, "and so I took the liberty of setting a small trap." Blakemore's eyes narrowed. "A trap?" Holmes smiled. "Indeed. You see, while you have been watching us, I have ensured that others have been watching you." As if on cue, the great doors to the manor burst open, and 6 officers stormed inside, their weapons drawn. Blakemore barely had time to react before they were upon him, seizing the revolver from his grasp. The struggle was brief, but the outcome was certain. Within moments Sir Reginald was restrained, his face pale with fury. Holmes stepped forward, peering at him with mild curiosity. "Tell me, Sir Reginald, was it worth it?" Blakemore glared at him, but said nothing. Holmes exhaled, then turned to Eleanor. "Miss Ashcombe, if you would be so kind as to retrieve the book." She nodded numbly and hurried away. As the officers led Blakemore from the hall, Watson let out a breath he had been holding. "Holmes, you never fail to astound me." Holmes merely shrugged. "The game, my dear Watson, is only ever as difficult as the player makes it. Now, let us see what secrets Lord Ashcombe left behind." He turned toward the staircase, his eyes gleaming with the anticipation of one final revelation. The reveal. Eleanor Ashcombe returned within minutes, the old volume of poetry clutched tightly in her hands. She hesitated for a moment, then extended it to Holmes. "This is the book my uncle gave me," she said. "If there is anything hidden within, I never suspected it." Holmes took the worn, leather-bound volume, his fingers tracing the faded gold lettering on the spine. He flipped through the pages with the precision of a surgeon, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. Then, suddenly, he stopped. "A hollowed compartment," he murmured. With delicate care, he pried open a section within the book's binding, revealing a small bundle of folded documents. Holmes withdrew them, unfolding the first page as Watson and I leaned in. The heading read, "Last Will and Testament of Lord Charles Ashcombe." Eleanor gasped. "His will! But my uncle's will was already read. Sir Reginald claimed I was not named in it." Holmes nodded, his expression grim. "Because the will read at the time of your uncle's death was a forgery. This is the true document, one that names you as the rightful heir to his estate." Watson exhaled sharply. Then Sir Reginald stood to gain everything by ensuring this document never saw the light of day. Holmes continued examining the papers, and here, correspondence between Lord Ashcombe and his solicitor. He suspected Sir Reginald of financial misconduct. It seems Blakemore had been siphoning funds from the family estate for years. Once confronted, he realized his only escape was through deception and ultimately murder. Eleanor's hands trembled. "He killed my uncle to keep this hidden?" "Indeed," Holmes said. "But your uncle, it seems, anticipated treachery. He entrusted this book to you, suspecting that if anything happened to him, You might hold the key to revealing the truth. Watson frowned. But what of Alice Harrow? How did she become involved? Holmes's gaze darkened. Alice Harrow was a quiet observer, but she was observant nonetheless. She must have overheard something. Perhaps she saw Sir Reginald tampering with the will, or noticed the missing book and made the connection. When she attempted to confess what she knew, she signed her own death warrant. A heavy silence filled the hall as the gravity of the revelation settled over us. Then, from the doorway, the voice of Inspector Lestrade broke the spell. "I must say, Holmes, you never cease to surprise me," he said, stepping forward. "We have Sir Reginald in custody. He's refusing to speak, but I doubt he'll have much choice now that you've uncovered this." Blakemore descended the stairs, his steps measured, his grip on the revolver steady. "You meddling fool," he growled. "You should have left well enough alone." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "And yet, here we are. The book, I presume, contains evidence, perhaps letters, financial records, or an altered will, something that would expose you." Blakemore's eyes flickered just for an instant, but it was enough. Holmes pressed on. "Lord Ashcombe discovered your betrayal, and he intended to ruin you. But rather than allow that to happen, you silenced him. When Alice Harrow came to, close to the truth, you silenced her as well." Blakemore's lips curled into a sneer. "And now I must silence you." The tension in the room was suffocating. The officers stood at the ready, but none dared make the first move. I could feel my own pulse hammering in my ears. Holmes, however, remained utterly composed. "I anticipated you might take such drastic action, Sir Reginald," he said lightly, "and so I took the liberty of setting a small trap." Blakemore's eyes narrowed. "A trap?" Holmes smiled. "Indeed. You see, while you have been watching us, I have ensured that others have been watching you." As if on cue, the great doors to the manor burst open, and 6 officers stormed inside, their weapons drawn. Blakemore barely had time to react before they were upon him, seizing the revolver from his grasp. The struggle was brief, but the outcome was certain. Within moments Sir Reginald was restrained, his face pale with fury. Holmes stepped forward, peering at him with mild curiosity. "Tell me, Sir Reginald, was it worth it?" Blakemore glared at him, but said nothing. Holmes exhaled, then turned to Eleanor. "Miss Ashcombe, if you would be so kind as to retrieve the book." She nodded numbly and hurried away. As the officers led Blakemore from the hall, Watson let out a breath he had been holding. "Holmes, you never fail to astound me." Holmes merely shrugged. "The game, my dear Watson, is only ever as difficult as the player makes it. Now, let us see what secrets Lord Ashcombe left behind." He turned toward the staircase, his eyes gleaming with the anticipation of one final revelation. The reveal. Eleanor Ashcombe returned within minutes, the old volume of poetry clutched tightly in her hands. She hesitated for a moment, then extended it to Holmes. "This is the book my uncle gave me," she said. "If there is anything hidden within, I never suspected it." Holmes took the worn, leather-bound volume, his fingers tracing the faded gold lettering on the spine. He flipped through the pages with the precision of a surgeon, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. Then, suddenly, he stopped. "A hollowed compartment," he murmured. With delicate care, He pried open a section within the book's binding, revealing a small bundle of folded documents. Holmes withdrew them, unfolding the first page as Watson and I leaned in. The heading read, "Last Will and Testament of Lord Charles Ashcombe." Eleanor gasped. "His will! But my uncle's will was already read. Sir Reginald claimed I was not named in it." Holmes nodded, his expression grim. "Because the will read at the time of your uncle's death was a forgery. This is the true document, one that names you as the rightful heir to his estate." Watson exhaled sharply. Then Sir Reginald stood to gain everything by ensuring this document never saw the light of day. Holmes continued examining the papers, and here, correspondence between Lord Ashcombe and his solicitor. He suspected Sir Reginald of financial misconduct. It seems Blakemore had been siphoning funds from the family estate for years. Once confronted, he realized his only escape was through deception and ultimately murder. Eleanor's hands trembled. "He killed my uncle to keep this hidden?" "Indeed," Holmes said. "But your uncle, it seems, anticipated treachery. He entrusted this book to you, suspecting that if anything happened to him, you might hold the key to revealing the truth." Watson frowned. "But what of Alice Harrow? How did she become involved?" Holmes's gaze darkened. Alice Harrow was a quiet observer, but she was observant nonetheless. She must have overheard something. Perhaps she saw Sir Reginald tampering with the will, or noticed the missing book and made the connection. When she attempted to confess what she knew, she signed her own death warrant. A heavy silence filled the hall as the gravity of the revelation settled over us. Then, from the doorway, the voice of Inspector Lestrade broke the spell. "I must say, Holmes, you never cease to surprise me," he said, stepping forward. "We have Sir Reginald in custody. He's refusing to speak, but I doubt he'll have much choice now that you've uncovered this." Holmes continued to play, the melody shifting into something softer, contemplative. "A curious question, Watson, and what prompts it?" I gestured toward the letter from Eleanor Ashcombe, now resting on the side table. "She departs to begin anew, freed from the web of deceit that nearly consumed her. And yet, not all our cases end so neatly. Many culprits elude the gallows, and many victims find no solace in truth alone." Holmes allowed a small, knowing smile. "Ah, but Watson, the pursuit of truth is not for the comfort of those who seek it. It is for the necessity of justice itself. Whether that justice is dispensed by the courts or simply by the weight of revelation, it serves its purpose." I exhaled slowly. "And Sir Reginald, do you think he truly regrets his actions?" Holmes set his violin aside and leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Regret is a fickle thing. Some men regret only being caught. Others, when faced with the inevitability of their downfall, come to understand the futility of their ambitions. Whether Sir Reginald finds remorse within his prison walls is of no consequence. The world will move on, with or without him." I nodded thoughtfully, watching as the rain outside streaked the windows, washing the streets clean. Holmes suddenly stood, his sharp eyes twinkling with renewed energy. "But enough of introspection, my dear Watson. The world is full of mysteries, and we have lingered long enough upon this one. Tell me, have you read the morning papers?" I raised a brow. "Not yet. And why do you ask?" A knowing smirk played at Holmes's lips as he tossed a folded newspaper into my lap. Because, my friend, another puzzle presents itself. A locked-room murder on the docks, a missing heirloom of great historical value, and, if I am not mistaken, a case that will test our faculties once more. I chuckled, shaking my head as I scanned the headlines. Holmes, you truly are incapable of rest. He retrieved his coat and hat, already striding toward the door. Rest is for those without purpose, Watson, and as long as London keeps its secrets, I shall have mine. With a sigh and a smile I rose, donning my own coat as I followed him out into the rain-slicked streets. Another mystery awaited, and with it the brilliance of Sherlock Holmes would once again be put to the test.